This film, The Four Seasons, Life on the Land, in 2022, is the third in a series about the island of North Ronaldsay in Orkney. The prior two were It's About Time in 2018 and The Lobster Chronicles in 2020, describing life on the sea. Our goal is to create a series of films, each focusing on a different aspect of island culture, history, and life. Future topics will include life in the home, education, arts, skills and trades, literature, crafts, celebrations, music, dance, song, interviews and dialect, science, religion and spirituality, the supernatural, the cycles of life, births, marriages and deaths, the Millennium Celebration, the World Wars, the North Ronaldsay diaspora, New Islanders, transportation, the Lairds and island governance, a new community, and the future. The films are not documentaries in the traditional sense, but rather incorporate movies, videos, sound recordings, and photos into a film portraying the life and culture that we hope will be entertaining, educational, and evocative, while also encompassing documentary and archival dimensions. More detail is incorporated than typical in a documentary film. We rely on film, sound recordings, videos, and photos taken by the Scott family, USA, over the last 6 decades, and particularly on recordings by Wendelin and Kelvin Scott when they spent a year on the island in 1995 to 1996. We also draw on many other sources listed in the credits and at the end of the film, and we thank the individuals and organizations who generously provided their work. In particular, we thank Ian Scott of the North Ronaldsay Archives Project for sharing his extensive knowledge of North Ronaldsay's history and culture. We know there are many other collections to which we do not have access. Perhaps these may be incorporated someday. A few scenes in this film may be disturbing to some, such as butchering a sheep, a bull fertilizing a cow, neutering a young bull calf, and scenes of sheep trapped in tides and undertows, but usually rescued. We include these scenes to document some of the challenges of life on a small remote island. As far as we know, these are the only known recordings of such events in North Ronaldsay. Some of the recordings have suffered damage over the decades from floods and extreme changes in temperature, but we believe they still provide a record of life on a small remote community which can never be recorded again, but which will be available to future generations in documenting and interpreting a way of life now disappearing. But the spirit of place still remains, even as new islanders, ideas and cultures arrive, a pattern characteristic of the North Ronaldsay community for thousands of years. The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. These words of Alfred Lord Tennyson suggest that change will come to any community, but it is best to change slowly, reverently, and respectfully. For thousands of years, ever since people have lived and labored on the land, they have also looked to the sky, the cosmos, the stars, the sun and the moon and the planets to guide their activities on the earth. As early as 5,000 years ago, some of the first astronomers observed changes and noticed patterns. They built stone henges that told them of special moments, such as the winter and summer solstices and the spring and fall equinoxes. This helped them to know when to plant crops before winter descended, for example. Also, already 5,000 years ago, people began naming constellations and using their positions to know when to plant and reap long before the advent of calendars. When Orion started to be fully visible, winter was coming, or they could look at the summer triangle to know that summer and spring were coming. Later, the plough was named after an agricultural implement. Taurus the Bull is one of the oldest named constellations, dating back 6,000 years to the very dawn of civilization in ancient Sumer. It is appropriate, therefore, to begin our journey of life on the land, the Four Seasons, by traveling with our Earth from outer space and the edges of our Milky Way galaxy to the tiny island of North Ronaldsay. a mere speck in the vast cosmos. Yet it is on this speck that our story takes place. Even this little island shows its own connection to the cosmos with the solitary 5,000-year standing stone. Astonishingly, the carved hole is in perfect alignment with the setting sun on the shortest day of winter. These connections between the land and the cosmos are strikingly described in Robert Rendell's poem The Horse Mill, where he compares the horses tramping round in circles to drive the threshing machinery. He compares them to the planets circling the hub of the sun. The Horse Mill by Robert Rendell. Beside the heavenly meadows daisied with stars, the planets yoked in team, Uranus, Mars, Jove, Neptune, Venus, Mercury, Saturn, Earth, not saddled now to run with Titan girth, but to the mill's unwieldy lever bound, wheel their enormous burden round and round, linked to the trees, harnessed with pain and trace, they stumble round the tracks of cosmic space. With slow hard step, necks bent and flanks a sweat, turning yon beam the sun for axle set, to grind what corn and what celestial mill move these great Titans, shouldering onwards still. In the time of the standing stone construction, the island was divided into roughly 3 equal parts for 3 brothers, presumably part of a Pictish community, by massive dikes, maybe 10 feet high. The remainder of these giant structures are still visible today as the Muckelgersty Dyke and the Matches Dyke. Thousands of years later, the Vikings came and divided the land according to the Udal system of runrigs, strips of land, sometimes only 10 feet wide, shared among the population of the island and rotating each year to give each land worker equal use of land that was superior or inferior. The remnants of the runrig system are still to be seen in the northeast corner of the island today. Another 1,000 years passed, and the Scottish rulers and lairds partitioned the land more efficiently into small crofts, typically with 20 acres each, a design that persists to this day, but with fewer working crofters. Some crofts, however, were as small as 3 acres, such as South Gravity, shown here with its traditional button-bend design, with the byre and barn behind. It must have been hard to earn a living. As the population has dwindled from some 500 in the 19th century to fewer than 60 today, the few remaining crofters have an island almost partitioned into 3 parts, with 1 crofter in the north end, 2 in the middle, and only 3 or 4 in the south. Perhaps in a few more years the 3 parts will have only 1 crofter each, as it was thousands of years ago with the 3 brothers. Long may the island continue with its unique ways of life, evolving as it has always done, with new people arriving, with new cultures, and new ways of living on the land. The 4 seasons will still be there. We begin with spring, season of new growth, new beginnings, and new life. Margaret Tate, the pioneering Orcadian filmmaker, poet, and writer, describes how spring in Orkney could also be hard. But in the north, the spring is a hard time. Bird song pierces and strong winds blow. Strong birds float softly on the strong sea. Wild flashing sea stutters on hard green land. Green cries to us, blue and white laugh at us. And we stand, buffeted, laughing, crying against the sea. Oh, who would choose the sweetness and not know the saltness, flashing whiteness, and the strength? In spring, the life cycle also begins with cows being taken to the bull to be fertilized. A cow in heat being taken to be bulled. In North Ronaldsay, children did not need to hear creative stories about the life cycles. They could see mating, life and death firsthand. Like the animals, the land too had to be fertilized for new life and growth to begin. Early on from the 18th century, seaweed, or ware, was spread on the land, probably carried up from the shore in baskets or wheelbarrows. After horses were introduced in the 18th century, they later brought the ware up in carts over roads carved out on the beach, which are still visible today. As the seaweed became more valued for export, animal manure, or dung, was substituted as more cattle were imported. Until the 1980s, animals were housed indoors in the byres for the winter, and then dung collected and spread using horse and cart. The dung collection from dighting the byres was a daily chore, shoveling the refuse from the odel, or trench, to the outside middens. In the spring, the dung from the midden was forked onto a lorry drawn by a tractor, an increase in efficiency compared to the horse and cart. Then it was off to the field to spread the fertilizer. This is actually a reenactment in 1995. Loading and spreading by hand ended around 1970. The dung was dragged off in clumps, regularly spaced. Then it had to be spread, a time-consuming task. The next stage in evolution of speed and efficiency came with the power-driven loader, which reduced the time by probably a factor of 5. This lorry was equipped with a mechanized dung spreader. Gone were the forked piles of dung, which were spread by hand. Next, the fertilizer and the ground were ploughed. Here is in a classic horse-drawn single-furrow plough, now rusting away. But no doubt in early times, the primitive ploughs were hauled by women, as they are still in some parts of Thailand and Russia, even today. This photo from the 1930s shows a woman leading a pair of oxen, hauling the plough with a man at the stilts. Eventually a horse-ox team was deployed, combining strength with greater control, although 2 men were required to handle the plough and the reins. These practices have changed little in 500 years. In 15th century England, teams of oxen and of horses were used for ploughing. But in the mid-20th century there was another revolution with the arrival of tractors in North Ronaldsay. They could pull 3 furrow ploughs, another quantum jump in speed and efficiency. What changed much less was the sowing of the seed, sown by hand, from straw cubbies. Here we see John Scott of Northmans in 1935, William Thompson of Needon in 1955, and finally Ian Scott of Antebrick in 1995. The sacks of seed collected from the threshing in the winter are distributed strategically for sowing the entire field. "500 years ago it looked much the same, with a hand sower and a white bag of seeds and the birds.
Are you getting tired?
After the ploughing and sowing, the ground was harrowed to cover the seed with earth.
That's how long it took?
Yes, with days, different with rice, days and that.
Not bad, not bad. How many acres?
2.5, I think it is.
3.5?
2.5.
2.5.
And finally, the seeded, harrowed land was rolled with a heavy metal roller to flatten the ground in preparation for the harvesting in autumn. All these activities have come to an end. No more sowing of oats or bear. Now it is artificial fertilizer for growing grass or hay as the basic crop. But potatoes continue to be planted, an activity for the whole family, including children. As are turnips, though with more elaborate equipment than this horse-drawn seeder. Another amusing job for children was collecting koeklepes, cowpats, for fuel in the fireplaces. Some calves had to be bottle-fed when their mothers had an inadequate supply of milk. And every evening, the cows had to be milked by hand. In 1995, it was still possible to see the odd goat being milked this way. In the old days, it was common on a quiet evening, with the birds calling, to see someone with a cow on a rope tether grazing the grass along the roadside. It was a peaceful and leisurely activity, giving time to think and reflect on life. In this peaceful scene, the man seems to have his eyes cast on far-off shores and other distant horizons. The North Ronaldsay sheep are a major component of life on the land. Punding of the sheep is an activity for all seasons. In spring, the purpose is to bring the females with lamb inside from the foreshore, where they are usually confined and where they live mainly on seaweed. They are a unique breed, numbering 3,500, dating back 5,000 years, and are one of the few mammals in the world to live on seaweed. A stone dike, built in 1832, confines them to the foreshore, but in the lambing season they need supplemental nourishment from grass. The following video from 1985 shows the herding of the sheep into a pond, one of several stone-built enclosures located strategically at several places, and part of the 13-mile stone dike round the entire island, perhaps the longest stone wall in the world. The ponding begins with one team gathering to start rounding up the sheep on one section of the beach and driving them towards the pond. Participants have to be nimble and fleet of foot to run over the often slippery stones and rocks. They drive the sheep in one direction, past the location of the pond. Once at the pond, they form a line to prevent the sheep from running back from where they have come. Netting wire is used as a blockade in areas of rocks and sea. Another team brings the sheep from the opposite side of the section. As the teams converge and the two lines close in, the sheep will often break and try to get past the two lines of ponders to avoid being driven into the pond. But the lines hold firm, and eventually all the sheep are channeled into the pond. Ponding has been a yearly event for almost 200 years. This example is from 1935. But by 2018, the numbers of people able and available to participate have been diminishing.
As the island population has decreased over the years, new ways have been found to encourage the sheep to move.
It does take a bit of skill, but you pick it up eventually. Usually in the beginning somebody says, just stand here, just stand there, just walk over there. Okay, then you pick it up. For the most part, everybody gets involved and we get folk off island, friends and family that come back to help. It's certainly something I suppose the incomers are going to have to learn in order to keep the tradition going. There's a lot of stuff we just sort of, we rely on the older folk to explain what we're doing and where to stand and
Pond here, trying to push the sheep from this side of the island round past the pond, but we've got to get them all past this point first. So that's what they're all doing with the vehicles.
In the midst of constant toil, people still created gardens. Here's Sarah Knight of Nowster, and Kathleen Scott creating a millennial garden of native plants at South Gravity. Here Ian Scott makes music from a native plant.
No.
The punding of sheep was also a major summer activity. Here the objective was to clip or roo their heavy winter fleeces, making the sheep more comfortable during the summer and fall. The fleeces were used to spin wool. A summer punding around 1935, with some sheep already clipped and the crofters searching for others. Punding has been taking place for over 150 years with little change. Except perhaps for the improvements in the efficiency of the scissors or shears. We turn now to the major industry in North Ronaldsay for some 200 years. That is the burning of seaweed to form kelp, which is rich in iodine. The solidified balls were shipped off to various industries. The income produced was sufficient to support over 500 people on the island into the late 19th century, when the industry collapsed as manufacturers turned to other countries. This led to a massive migration of young people to Ely and other parts of the world. The small crofts were unable to support the population. Burning kelp. Although hard and unpleasant work, the long hours allowed islanders to tell stories and discuss the affairs of the world. Evidence of kelp making can still be seen around the coastline. Later, after the kelp industry died, similar steeds were used to dry the tangles after it was discovered that the unburned seaweed could be shipped to industries such as alginate. This opened up a new industry, although much less lucrative than the kelp, which continued into the end of the 20th century. We shall now describe some features of the tangle industry. The steeds, or base, of stone on the shore, these were used to dry the tangles before they were burned and exported to manufacture various products from the iodine and potassium.
Yes, and the tangles the whole way.
If you could get all of the tangles that are on the beach right now, you would have a lot of money.
You won't have much money except you work in them.
Yeah.
That's what folk do. But has this possible to make something like what would you call a good working wage, no, a good living wage?
For labouring wage, I think anything over £4 an hour would be a good wage.
It's fairly possible with a tractor, and the tractor not doing very much, to make at least £10 an hour.
That's a good wage.
It's a good living wage.
Wendell and I have been tempted to do it.
But I tell you, if you do it, I'll be very pleased to see you doing it. But if you start that, the rest of the work gets left behind.
That's the problem. That's what happened with our other work too.
Yes, exactly.
We would like to do it, but we also thought that Bertie said we should get oilskins if we do it.
Yes, you need oilskins.
By the time we thought, well, £60 for oilskins for both of us.
Yes.
That would be £120 because the oilskins, they're expensive. They're not cheap.
And you do need good clothes.
Yeah.
And you're also better with a tractor. But a tractor is not necessarily, because I remember a hell of a lot of times going up without one.
The tangles were then shipped away from the pier by steamer. Here we see the Earl Thorfinn steamer, cargo and passenger boat, approaching the pier, just as the much bigger tangle boats would. When the kelp industry failed, the enterprising islanders turned to egg production. Every croft would have hens, numbering from maybe 100 or fewer up to several hundreds, kept in special hen houses, or sometimes an old lobster boat turned upside down after its seagoing days were over. In winter storms, the hen houses could be blown out to sea. The eggs were shipped to Kirkwall every 2 weeks. It is hard to imagine that they were always fresh, at least by today's standards.
Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Check, check, check. Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check.
The hens needed houses to protect them from the elements. Alfie Swanee describes how hens sometimes made their own from an upturned boat. Then the crofters expanded on that idea, creating a house deliberately from a boat that had outlived its seagoing days. Eventually, proper hen houses were designed as the number of hens increased.
And I remember that old boat out here, lying out where the meadow is now, the hens used to go under it. And we used to pull the eggs out where the hens went into lay. We used to pull them out with a hoe. Sort of hen shelter, hen house.
Is that what when you see the boats upturned, were they used as hen houses?
That was just a section of the boat that I remember. The houses that were turned into hen houses was smaller boats, you know, not the heavy boats. The heavy boats were very big boats. They had heavy timbers on them and all that.
Yes. Must have been difficult to get the eggs out of the small hen houses, though.
Oh no, you just went into the door. They used to check that hen houses about twice a year.
Why was that?
Well, there was good reasons for it. The one was that any lost grain, a lot of grain, then they were put on the cultivated land, the late or back of harvest when the stooks was taken in, and they picked up a part of the living of the land. And then when the land was cultivated, they had to be taken back, and they used to be shipped them about twice a year.
And sometimes blown out to sea in fierce winter gales of 100 miles per hour.
And that was one of the days when the North Ronaldsay houses lived on eggs. You saw that in the pictures the other night, eggs being exported.
Yeah, the boxes of Orkney eggs, yes.
Yes, aye.
But when you say lived on them, they lived on the money from them, or they lived...
Yeah, money from them,
Right.
yes. We used to go to the shops, to trade the shop, and take home money every year.
Sydney says he used to have 3,000 hens at Enderbreck.
Oh no, they're not at 3,000.
No?
No, I don't think so.
He's
I
pulling
think
my leg again.
you may knock off and nothing there.
300
300 would have been a lot in a small house. Yes. But Holland had about, Holland, when they were working eggs, they had about a box a day, which was 30 dozen a day.
And would you collect eggs all week and send them off with every steamer?
It wasn't every week either, it was just every fortnight.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yes. They only had a boat once a fortnight.
During a period in the 1930s, produce including eggs were sent by plane, a pioneering venture by Captain Fresson, although this photo was probably contrived as an advertising gimmick. In a scene reminiscent of the Wild West, we see the process in action, with three men, Oliver Scott, Charles Thompson and Albert Scott.
seen people make more fuss getting their teeth pulled.
When bulls reached the end of their reproductive life, they were shipped away from the island. Perhaps thinking of happier bygone days and glories. The meal mills, another part of life on the land, now gone. The oats and corn, or bear, were ground into meal in the mills. Here also an evolution has led to greater speed and efficiency. The old quern grinding stones, turned by hand, were replaced in the early 19th century, first by a water-driven mill, then by wind power, and finally by an engine-powered mill in 1907. It operated for 50 years until 1957, over which time there were several millers, including Sidney Scott of Antebrick. We shall hear him describing some of the challenges later. The early 19th century watermill at Hooking. The original cogged water wheel. Probably similar to this one, which is still turning. The late 19th century wind-powered mill. All that remains is the stone base.
There were a thing on the top there, it turned with the wind. And this built here like this, that, which is the head. The teeth of this wheel is wood, beech. This is new teeth that was put in the meantime. Your furnace is down about 13 feet below this. Corn took about 7 hours to dry. Oats took about 9. 8 to 9. Mud took 10 hours.
But the studies started to make it here, but he took the far shorter. He reduced the time. He reduced the time.
Operation of the mill was challenging for one person, since there were many tasks going on simultaneously. Sidney Scott describes an event where the drying malt in the chill caught fire. Fortunately, evasive action was taken in time, and only a portion of the malt was lost, but the mill itself was saved.
And I was just been on up here, middle of all, and we come out and I looking up and I said I was switched off the light in the chill. And I came back and the damn flame was just touching the beams there when I come in.
What did you do?
I lifted it on a bleach from the wood and I let the damn lock go to the bottom. And they could burn it like it, and I saved the race.
As we have mentioned earlier, the island is encircled by a stone-built dike round the 13-mile circumference. Construction began in 1832, when the then laird decided that more cattle should be imported, and therefore the sheep should be confined to the foreshore. The sheep are an historic breed, dating back 5,000 years, and genetically evolved to survive mainly on seaweed. The dike itself is now listed as a Class A monument by Historic Environment Scotland, the same classification as St Magnus Cathedral. The dike encircling the foreshore. The cruise or planty cruise for planting vegetables. The dike is sometimes over 6 feet high and sometimes looks more like a work of art in its variegated colours. Holes were deliberately built into the dike to allow the winds to blow through. Nevertheless, sections of the dike were often destroyed by winter storms. Teams of islanders rallied to rebuild, here in 1935 and then in 1995. In fact, the art of dike building and repair has continued pretty much unchanged for almost 200 years. It is hard to mechanize or automate what is essentially a skilled creative art. But in recent years, fewer and fewer islanders are able to undertake this strenuous work. So now, the Orkney Sheep Foundation and the North Ronaldsay Trust arrange for volunteers to come in from all over the world, to come for 2 weeks in the summer to help to rebuild the dike. And in addition, there is a full-time sheep dike warden, Sean Tarrant, to organise the effort. Harvest activities began in the summer with the singling of neeps, i.e. separating the profusion of turnips growth, leaving one root to develop into a strong plant. As children, we were always terrified of knocking out the entire bunch, leaving a gap with no turnip to grow. We would hastily replant a root, a futile exercise, since they never grew again. This served, however, to cover up the mistake for the moment, so that our parents would not notice. Singling turnips was hard and tedious work, so crofters often assembled into collaborative teams to make the task more cheerful. Singling has remained pretty much unchanged over time, even centuries. Here is a modern hoe blade, and an almost identical one 200 years ago. And people still work in the same staggered teams, so that they can converse over the long, tedious hours of singling. In the 21st century, luxuriant fields of turnips are seen no more. They used to be fed to cattle, but now only a few are grown for domestic use. Another aspect of changing times. Cutting with a sickle, as used to be the practice in North Ronaldsay, and here it is in Turkey. According to John Cutt of Gerbo, the scythe was 10 times faster than the sickle. Both men and women participated. Sometimes neighbours would form a team to make the work faster and more cheerful. Ian Scott sharpening a scythe, not as easy as it looks. The horse and reaper increased the speed by another factor of 10. The horses had to be shod with iron shoes to avoid damage to their feet. The hay was raked into small coals to dry. A process that has changed little in 500 years. Though energetic work, It allowed leisurely picnics, sitting beside a coal. After drying, the coals were brought in and built into stacks. The stacks could be impressive in size, as this one at Upper Linney, and form a background for a family photo. One of the last haystacks to be built in North Ronaldsay with Ian Scott and Ella Henderson. By 1995, the gathering into coals and stacks ended, and the hay was compressed into bales, seen here with a different crop. The bales were then stacked onto a lorry, calling for some very heavy lifting. And then built into gigantic stacks, taking less time than building a stack of loose hay, which had to be pitched with forks. But by the end of the 20th century, this practice ended. Finally, in the 21st century came the high-speed mowers. We may only marvel at what the men and women of old with their scythes would have thought. Perhaps no more surprising than the transitions from sickles to scythes or to horse-drawn mowers. The hay is scooped up and compressed into circular bales and wrapped in plastic. Then the bales are deposited on the field and picked up by other machines. Now it is all fast and efficient. No more leisurely picnics leaning against a large coal of hay. The bales are then assembled into their own equally impressive stacks. The old and the new, the stacks of old and the bales of the new in the moonlight. The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. Punding took place in all 4 seasons, including autumn. The autumn punding was mainly to select sheep for sending off to markets. North Ronaldsay mutton is Slow Food Scotland's first Presidium product, food that is good, clean and fair. The mutton has a unique taste, since the main diet is seaweed. Looking for sheep to catch in a pund. How was a particular sheep identified amongst the hundreds in a pund? Each sheep had marks, such as the notch shown here. The crofters in North Ronaldsay developed an intricate set of marks under the direction of the sheep court, led by the laird, such as the example shown on the right. The combinations made it difficult for someone to change the mark in order to claim the sheep belonged to them. Since the 1990s, alternative methods are also used, such as the plastic ring shown here, or paint colours. The sheep were not only a valuable source of food for the islanders, particularly in winter when the storms brought copious supplies of seaweed. Their wool was also spun into yarn, here seen in the 1930s, on foot and hand-operated spinning wheels. Now there are power looms. A power loom operated by Jane Donnelly at the North Ronaldsay wool mill.
Pull it through, but don't take
a lesson
the
in
stitch off
knitting
your
the
left
finished
hand
wool.
needle. Put it into the front, over and off, and you now have 2 stitches from 1. That's an increase.
Jenny, what happens now? Jenny, do you
A recreation of making a riveling, a shoe made from sheepskin, by Alfie Swanee, guided by people who lived while this craft was still in use.
No.
An old man sits in a straw-backed chair wearing ribbons. A child wearing ribblings.
No.
Sydney Scott demonstrates making a simon, a rope woven from straw.
That's the way it looks. And one of this should always be longer than the other.
And teaches this art to Wendell and Scott 2 generations on.
Get started, come on.
That much? More?
And here the simons are put to use to make a roof covering flagstones underneath for a watertight roof. 3 generations quarrying flagstones: John Scott, William Scott and Oliver Scott of North Manse. Flagstones being lifted into place on the roof at Treb, and at Upper Linney, a precarious-looking operation. Before the full harvesting of potatoes, a few would be dug for a meal, as here by Winifred Scott.
Good idea.
And similarly with turnips or neeps. Willie of Ericott brings greater power to bear gathering turnips with a horse and cart and a tool for pulling and slicing. Then the full harvesting would begin with more people and eventually machinery. 2 people at work gathering potatoes. Then 4 people. And eventually the full power of machinery with tractors and potato diggers. But the back-breaking work of gathering potatoes remains. It was often a family affair. Then the harvesting of the oats and corn began. Here too a progression of increasing speed and efficiency took place over the decades. 500 years ago the sickle was used to cut crops. It was used in North Ronaldsay until the 18th century, and as shown here, still in Turkey today. The sickle was replaced by the scythe in the 19th century. According to John Cutt of Gerbo, the scythe was 10 times faster than a sickle. Even greater efficiency and enjoyment came through teams working together. Technological improvements were made to the scythe to make it more efficient. An attachment cleared the cut swath to the side so that the next cut was easier. Here we see Tammy Thompson of Wybanks with a scythe that has the attachment on it. And here he is with the scythe in action, and another scythe in a different time and a different place. The scythe was superseded by the horse-drawn reaper another gain in speed and efficiency. Then came the sophisticated automated binder, which produced bound sheaves. Here it is drawn by 3 horses, which William Scott of North Mance could easily handle, having worked 6-horse teams in Canada. But the horses had their days go too, with the arrival of the power tractors in the 1930s. The tractor-drawn binder became the universal method of cutting crops up to the end of the 20th century, when growing crops came to an end altogether. The crop was cut by blades and fell onto transporting sheets, which brought the cutting up to the mechanism which collected enough straw for a sheaf, binding it with string and then ejecting it. The binders were complicated machines, and sometimes weeds and thistles in the crop would jam the transporting sheets, and then everything ground to a halt until the offending weeds were cleared out.
Sometimes the road is rocky along the way, boys.
Sidney Scott waits patiently on the tractor. He might be forgiven for perhaps thinking back to simpler times, with just 2 horses and a reaper. Perhaps even to the days of just a team of men with scythes. A harvest scene at the farm of Pertebreck. Here Lottie Tulloch is seen laying back the face of the crop, which in damp weather can fall over, making the next cut difficult for the binder. She lays the crop back using the handle of a pitchfork. When everything ran smoothly, it was a beautiful sight to behold. The work is tiring, and here Oliver Scott and Charles Thompson enjoy a break with a beer and a cigarette. The bound sheaves are gathered into stooks, 6 sheaves at a time to dry. Here seen with Ian Scott. Here a loose sheaf is rebound with a handmade bund. Each house traditionally had its own distinctive twist on the knot, so that sheaves blown from a field to another during a gale could be identified. Such was the attention to gather every bit of the harvest. A glorious sight at the end of the day. Finally, the sheaves are built into a stack, usually in the yard near the dwelling house, but sometimes out in the field. The harvest comes to an end with the binder leaving the field, both literally and figuratively. The harvesting of oats and corn bare came to an end as the 20th century ended, and with it the binders now rust in a field. In the 20th century the island was a patchwork of many different fields of oats, corn and grass. In the 21st century, the island has become one green and pleasant land, with grass as the predominant crop. Sky, sea, fields of stubble, the reaper wheels a whirl of days and years, darkness and light turning. Song for Autumn. Don't you imagine the leaves dream now, how comfortable it will be to touch the earth instead of the nothingness of the air and the endless freshets of wind? And don't you think the trees, especially those with many hollows, are beginning to look for the birds that will come, 6, a dozen, to sleep inside their bodies? And don't you hear the goldenrod whispering goodbye, the everlasting being crowned with the first tuffets of snow? The pond stiffens, and the white fields over which the fox runs so quickly brings out its long blue shadows. The wind wags its many tails, and in the evening the pile of firewood shifts a little, longing to be on its way. Despite all appearances, nature is not dead in winter. It has gone underground to renew itself and prepare for spring. Winter is a time when we are admonished and even inclined to do the same for ourselves. The winter pundings were to catch sheep for food and for the celebrations. They could be difficult with much heavier waves and seas. The sheep were more likely to break and escape past the advancing herding teams, and the process had to begin all over again. Here are the sheep breaking. The barricades are not effective. Sheep could become trapped in the waves, sometimes with fatal results, and sometimes rescued.
Freezes, you're already cold, already cold, cold.
This one is rescued successfully.
And it will steal your nose, but it will not steal your substance.
The rescue had its own hazards, since it was easy to be caught and drawn out by the powerful undertows of the waves.
As brothers we will stand and we'll hold your hand, hold your and you are the mother of your
This rescue effort was too difficult.
one to whom you gave life. And you have your choice of his. And these are what make my
But people persevered,
ladder to the stars. But you are not alone in this. And you are not alone in this. As brothers we will stand
and then success.
Hold your hand. But I will tell the night.
Another sheep is trapped in the knitting wire.
Lose your sight. But I can't move the mountain for you.
Now all the sheep are on their way to the pond. The sheep were at their best in winter when the storms brought copious supplies of seaweed. A sheep is selected and brought home to be budged.
and I made my feelings for you.
Winter was the time for the stacks of oats or corn built in the autumn to be brought into the barn by tractor and trailer for threshing. Or more leisurely in times gone by. The sheaves were then pitched from the lorry directly into the barn loft.
Except for maybe about 15 sheep.
And then threshed with a power mill to extract the oats and the corn heads from the straw. Here come the heads.
Except for maybe about 15 sheep.
And there goes the straw. All the sheaves were fed to cattle who were brought indoors during the winter months. Sidney Scott describes how he always spoke to the cattle in the byres.
Oh.
Since the 1980s, cattle stay outside all year round in all weathers. We may only speculate whether this is harder on them compared to the restricted movement when they were bound in the albeit warm byre with the stench of dung and decay. Who can tell? Here Sidney Scott is threshing the sheaves, separating the grain from the straw. Before the advent of threshing engines in the 20th century, the hand flail was used, although Sarah Thompson of Dennis Hill still used the flail even into the middle of the 20th century. Here is the flail in use in another country and another time. Between the flail and the power engines, there were the horse-powered mills, where the horses tramped round and round to drive the threshing machinery in the barn. The final stage was the mobile thresher, which eliminated the need to move the sheaves into the barn, but could be brought to the stacks out in the field. Once again, it was an evolution of higher speeds and increasing efficiency. By the end of the 20th century, all threshing ended. Since corn and oats were no longer cultivated, the land was now turned over to growing hay, that is, grass. And when the harvest was all over, the islanders gathered, as they have done probably for millennia in different ways, to celebrate the harvest home. The harvest is home safely for another year in 2019, and again in 2005. And it looks much the same in 1995 as Sidney and Tyos Scott make their entry into the same hall and the same tables and decorations. The climax of the Harvest Home celebration was the toast to the harvest, here delivered in 2019 by Bill Spence, former Lord Lieutenant of Orkney.
In some parishes, the Harvest Home was known as the Muckle Supper. And here I'm reminded of a story that my late father, Jim Spence, used to tell of a Muckle supper at Brodgar in Stennis, or rather the aftermath of the Muckle supper. It was a windy night, and we're familiar with that, a bit similar to what we have tonight, I think, with a westerly gale which had strengthened as the folk were celebrating without paying attention to the deteriorating weather outside. The Brodgar hospitality was legendary, and much home brew was enjoyed, so that when home time came, old Muir of the Brink was unable to push his bike into the wind, and he had to walk home. As he was passing Queena in the Grimlings, with his cap back to wind and the tail of his shirt billowing out behind him, he was seen by old Jimmy Queena, who was startled by the sight and shouted to his sleeping wife, "Get up, lass! We'll have to put the harrows on the stacks. The wind's gotten up and I've just seen a solan goose flying awful low and making little headway." Crops are, of course, very dependent upon the weather. In a dull, damp year with little sunshine or drying wind, it's a real struggle to cure the hay or ripen the oats. A wet back end was dreaded. I recall the harvest of, I think it was 1955 or thereabouts at Netheronston, when a very wet and windy autumn laid down all the standing oats, and the tractor and binder were often mired in the very soft ground. We youngsters knew instinctively that this was serious. Although our stoic parents did their best to contain their anxieties. That was the way in those days. No trying to blame anything other than nature, no claiming compensation from anyone. They believed that seed time and harvest was sure, but of course some years were much better than others. They happily rejoiced when the hay was cold and the screws built, and eventually we all went to the kirk one Sunday for Harvest Thanksgiving. So I would ask you to charge your glasses and please be upstanding and toast the harvest. The harvest.
The harvest home and other celebratory events were happy times in the dark days of winter. The community would come together to make decorations, such as the straw ornaments which decorated the halls.
And it's wise to keep them both about the same length to start with. You seize that one down, then you turn it round. That should be up to the middle. Now this is the crucial bit.
Very complex number of circles.
Seize. Now to get the loop, you make a loop. See? But that loop won't stay on, then it's up another loop. Now you've got a little loop to hang it up.
Okay, this may be
Could you display that against the wall, please? Very nice.
Winter was also the time for the brewing of ale from the harvested corn, with the malt made in the barns or at the old mill.
Good man, go to your yielding vet. We are a St. Mary's men, and fetch was here a quart of that for our lady. Good man, go to your yielding vet. We are a St. Mary's men, and fetch was here a quart of that for our lady.
A water boiler of old, used for the ale making. Now it sits holding only weeds. Sidney Scott, whom you just heard singing the New Year's song, always complained that it was nothing but a dirge, with its endless verses numbering some 160 or so. Presumably it helped to keep the first footers motivated on the long, cold road from house to house to welcome the new year. At each house, a quart of ale revived and warmed the revellers, with a feast to end the night at a designated house, rotating each year. Ian Scott recalls that another song was a favourite. Curiously, it came from America more than a century ago. When work crews came to North Ronaldsay in the 1930s to build the foghorn, they brought this song with them, but to their surprise the song had long preceded them. Perhaps the words, "Will the angels play their harps for me?" captured thoughts at the end of another year.
Oh, I wonder, yes, I wonder, will the angels play their harps for me? For my feet are and my heart is, will the angels play their harps for me?
And then, on New Year's Day, it was off to the Standing Stone in a bitter wind and after a night of revelry. And a recitation to recreate what may have taken place in the past. ending with a ring dance. Performing what probably has taken place for thousands of years, where we began this little story of life on the land. This story of life on the land shows that many activities changed little over the centuries. But in the 20th century, rapid evolution generally led to increasing speed and efficiency, and fewer people. The advances inevitably precipitated some loss of the ancient spiritual link between people and the land. Within a few generations, the speed of cutting hay, for example, increased by a factor of 1,000, while the population decreased by a factor of 10. Are we at risk of losing man's old inheritance of sea and soil? We have indeed come a long way from the time when a family might plant a few potatoes, cabbages and other vegetables in the little planty-crew enclosures by the seashore.
Moors long, an age-bent wife wi' aspect mild, stands gazing out to sea, or digs a speel, slowly, as if by vagrant touts beguiled, and sits her twa-three teddies i' the drill. No chance who firm she huds, be seek like toil, man's old inheritance of sea and soil.
Hours long, an age-bent wife with aspect mild stands gazing out to sea, or digs a while, slowly as if by vagrant thoughts beguiled, and sets her 2 or 3 potatoes in the furrow, nor knows how firm she holds by such light toil, man's old inheritance of sea and soil. Man's old inheritance of sea and soil reminds us that there are also harvests that come and go in our own lives, the passage from birth to death, from youth to old age, the times of darkness and of light, of joy and sadness, sowing and reaping, that we, like the land, need times of growth and dormancy and deep rest, which are essential to all living things, and the need to harvest when the time is right.
This is maybe a strange question, but do you think, do you prefer the old days to today, or do you prefer today to the old days?
The old days is better because I was younger. And your youth is the days that you remember best. And everybody wishes that they could reverse the process, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a difficult question. There's no real answer to it because we're far better off now than what we were when I was a boy.
You know, there are harvests that come in our life, and if you're not there at the particular harvest, you will never be able to harvest that particular year's gift again. You will have other harvests in your life, but that particular harvest will be gone forever, and you would not have reaped, you would not have stored, you would not have been nourished by that at all. It would have passed you by. There's only now, the place you are, the harvest of this moment, the harvest of this year. The song begins and the eyes are lifted, but the sickle points toward the ground, its downward curve forgotten in the song she hears, while over the dark wood, rising or setting, the sun lifts on cool air the small body of a singing lark. The song falls, the eyes raise, the mouth opens, and her bare feet on the earth have stopped. Whoever listens in this silence, as she listens, will also stand open, thoughtless, frightened by the joy she feels, the pathway in the field, branching to 100 more, no one has explored. What is called in her rises from the ground and is found in her body. What she is given is secret, even from her. This secret is the seed in her of everything she is, and falling through her body to the ground from which she comes, it finds a hidden place to grow, and rises and flowers in old, wild places where the dark-edged sickle cannot go. This secret is the seed in her of everything she is, and falling through her body to the ground from which she comes, it finds a hidden place to grow, and rises and flowers in old, wild places where the dark-edged sickle cannot go.
At the same time, we should be grateful for having left us a memorial of their highly cultured community. And perhaps we have something to learn from them about the state of our own culture.
Scant are the few green acres that I till, but above them spreads the boundless sky, ripening their crops, and round them lie long miles of moorland. Beyond the cliff top glimmers in the sun the far horizon's bright infinity, and I can gaze across the sea when my day's work is done. The solitudes of land and sea assuage my quenchless thirst for freedom unconfined. With independent heart and mind hold I my heritage. Orkney Crofter by Robert Rendell. Sky, sea, fields of stubble, the reaper wheels a whirl of days and years, darkness and light turning. Everything we have described here about the Four Seasons' life on the land happened on a tiny island, a mere speck on the surface of the earth, itself a mere dot in our universe. Yet people have lived, labored, loved, and learned here for thousands of years. We began our story by traveling through space to the planet Earth. That was appropriate since we come from the universe, and we are made of stardust from an exploding star billions of years ago. Now it is appropriate to retrace our steps back into that universe and see our Earth as a tiny dot, as recorded by the Voyager spacecraft in 1990, 3.7 billion miles from Earth. North Ronaldsay could not be visible anymore, but it is the place we call home, home on the land. And as far as we know, at present, the only place in this vast universe where our little story of the Four Seasons' life on the land, on this particular island, could take place. Although there are trillions of other galaxies just in our own universe, not to speak about other parallel universes where the same story could be unfolding.
If my words did glow with the gold of sunshine, and my tunes were played on the harp unstrung, would you hear my voice come through the music? Would you hold it near as it were your own? It's a hand-me-down. The thoughts are broken. Perhaps they're better left unsung. I don't know. Don't really care. Let there be songs to fill the air. Ripple in still water when there is no pebble tossed, nor wind to blow. Reach out your hand. If your cup be empty, if your cup is full, may it be again, let it be known. There is a fountain that was not made by the hands of men. There is a road, no simple highway between the dawn and the dark of night. And if you go, no one may follow. That path is for your steps alone. Ripple in still water when there is no pebble tossed, no wind to blow. You choose to lead, must follow. But if you fall alone. If you should stand then who's to guide you? If I knew the way, I would take you home. La da da da, la da da.